I welcome the opportunity to speak on this debate on hate speech and hate crime. One of the reasons why I welcome it is because there's a certain amount of confusion and uncertainty amongst the public as to what is meant by hate speech legislation or hate crime legislation. I think it would benefit from the Oireachtas being able to enunciate to the public what in fact is meant by that, because at one level you have people who are fearful of hate crime legislation because they think it's going to criminalise their thoughts or what they say privately, which it's not. And at the other side, you have certain people who think that there won't be any protection for minorities unless hate speech and hate crime legislation is enacted rapidly. At the outset, can I say that I welcome the proposal that hate crime and hate speech would be included within Article 83 of the treaty, so that directives could be promulgated and issued in respect of those offences. We all know that criminal justice is generally a competence of the member state, but there are certain types of criminal activity that the European Union and the member states have agreed to, through the ratification of the treaties, to decide that they also can be dealt with at a European Union level. For instance, we recognise that money laundering or illegal trafficking of humans is dealt with on a European Union level. Part of the reason for that is because it involves pan-jurisdictional offences, and it makes sense to have a European-wide legislation and directive to deal with it. I think we also need to have two principles at the forefront of our mind, however, when we're talking about hate speech and hate crime. One is that we know from experience and from history that groups can be targeted and subject to extraordinary violence and criminal activity as a result of the incitement to hatred against them. We saw that in particular in Europe in the 1930s when you look at the Jewish population of Europe and what happened to them. Second, however, I think we also need to take into account that freedom of expression is important. And this legislation, when it is enacted, people need to be protected into thinking that this is not going to ensure that their thoughts are going to be criminalised or that they won't be able to express their hatreds. There are many people in this country who hate politicians. I know members of this House may find that extraordinary. But even after legislation is enacted, they'll still be entitled to hate politicians. And some people hate lawyers and some people hate bankers, and legislation in respect of hate speech or hate crime isn't going to affect that. So I think we need to send out a message as to what is hate speech. Hate speech legislation will be legislation that's introduced to prohibit the public incitement to violence or hatred on grounds of race, colour, religion, your provenance or national or ethnic origin. We've had it on the statute book of this country since 1989. The Prohibition of Incitement to Hatred Act has been there, as I say, since 1989. There aren't many prosecutions under it, but it is a piece of legislation that exists. The important point to make about it is that it only really is triggered when somebody is out there advocating for hatred or violence against a particular group of people. I think in Ireland that we have very few examples of that. And I think that when this legislation is enacted that there will not be many prosecutions in respect of it, because I think people are measured and balanced in their public commentary. I think you'd probably have to go back to the previous century to find examples of people who are strenuously advocating incitement to violence or hatred against certain groups in this country based on their race, based on their religion, based on their sexual orientation, based on their gender. Then you come to look at what is hate crime. What is proposed when it comes to hate crime is that there will be an aggravated element to a sentence if a person is convicted of a criminal offence because they targeted an individual because of their race, because of their religion, or because of their identity. So if somebody assaults an individual and they assault them on racist grounds or xenophobic grounds, a court would be able to take into account when sentencing that person, take into account as an aggravating factor the fact that their personal motivation in committing the offence was based on the fact that they targeted the person with a xenophobic or racist motivation. So I think we need to be clear and careful as to what's meant by hate speech and hate crime. It's not going to change the world. It's not going to be the panacea to all our ills, but it is something that I think is beneficial and something that's there at present, and it's something that needs to be clarified in more detail. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.